Imagine standing on the edge of a river 8,000 years ago, watching a forest of reeds bend in the wind. Across the water is food, fish, birds, perhaps another group of people. The distance is not far. You could probably swim it. But swimming has one serious flaw. You have to become the boat. And suddenly, the problem becomes obvious. How do you carry yourself, your tools, your food, and eventually other people across water without becoming part of the local ecosystem? The answer seems simple to us. Build something that floats. But that sentence hides one of the most extraordinary technological achievements in human history. Because before there were ships, there had to be a moment when somebody looked at water and thought, in effect, I can travel on that. We do not know who that person was. We do not even know what their first boat looked like. And that is the strange part. The oldest boat we can physically hold today is already sophisticated enough to prove that it was not the beginning. It is the middle of the story. The Pest canoe, discovered in the Netherlands, is a hollowed-out Scots pine log roughly 3 meters long. Radiocarbon dating places it around 8250 to 7550 BCE. It is currently considered the oldest known surviving boat. But think about what had to happen before that piece of wood existed. Someone had to understand that a tree could be transformed into a vessel. Someone had to discover that removing the inside made it lighter while leaving enough wood around the outside preserved its strength. Someone had to make it stable enough to sit inside. Someone had to learn how to move it. And most importantly, someone had to learn all of this without having a manual. The Pest canoe is not the birth of boating. It is archaeological evidence that boating was already old. And that changes the question. The mystery is no longer, who invented the first boat? It becomes, what problem forced humans to start building things that could cross water in the first place? The answer probably begins much earlier than the Pest canoe. For most of human existence, water was not simply an obstacle. It was a resource. Rivers contained fish. Lakes concentrated animals. Coastlines provided shellfish, birds, sea mammals, and other food. But water also created an annoying contradiction. The richest environments could be separated by something humans were not naturally designed to cross efficiently. Our bodies are excellent at walking. They are not particularly impressive boats. So the first watercraft may not have begun as transportation technology at all. They may have begun as an extension of something humans already knew how to do. Float. A log already floats. A bundle of reeds can float. A piece of bark can float. A person can cling to something floating. The first great breakthrough may therefore have been less about inventing flotation and more about controlling it. That distinction matters. Because nature had already built the first boats. Humans simply started modifying them. A fallen tree could carry a person accidentally. But an accidental boat has a problem. It has no steering wheel, no comfortable seat, and absolutely no interest in where you want to go. So humans began turning floating objects into controllable platforms. Logs could be tied together. Reeds could be bundled. Wood could be shaped. And eventually, one of the simplest engineering ideas in history emerged. If the water can support the object, make the object large enough to support you. That sounds obvious now. It was not obvious when nobody had done it before. And there is another problem. A boat that floats is not necessarily a boat that works. A platform can stay on the surface and still be almost useless. It can tip, can spin, it can become impossible to steer, can fill with water. It can drift away from shore while its inventor watches helplessly. The difference between something that floats and something that transports humans is control. That is where the real technology begins. A paddle turns a floating object into something you can propel deliberately. A shaped hull reduces resistance. A wider platform can increase stability. A deeper vessel can carry more. A stronger structure can survive rougher water. And each improvement creates another possibility. You can travel farther. You can carry more. You can return. You can transport things that cannot swim. Eventually, water stops being a boundary. It becomes a road. And once humans realized that, geography itself changed. But there is a much bigger clue hiding in a place where boats should not have survived. Australia. When modern humans reached Sahul, the ancient landmass connecting Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania, They had to cross stretches of sea from Southeast Asia. The precise timing remains debated, with evidence and models placing human arrival roughly in the tens of thousands of years ago. Recent genetic research has argued for dates around 60,000 years ago. Whatever exact date we ultimately accept, the technological implication is enormous. These people were not simply walking along a coastline. At several points, land was not continuously connected. Some water crossings required genuine maritime capability, and the boats themselves are mostly gone. Wood rots, reeds disappear, fiber cordage decays. A canoe can become nothing more than a dark stain in sediment, and eventually even that can vanish. So archaeology gives us an awkward picture of human technology. The evidence for the first boats may be missing precisely because boats were made from materials that disappear. We are trying to reconstruct a technological revolution from its footprints after the road itself has dissolved. This also explains why the pest canoe is so important. It survives. That is not the same thing as being first. Imagine discovering the oldest surviving smartphone and announcing that humans invented smartphones on the day it was manufactured. You would be confusing the oldest thing that survived with the beginning of the technology. The same problem applies to ancient boats. The archaeological record is not a video recording. It is a collection of survivors. And sometimes the most important technology leaves almost nothing behind. Which means the first boat may have been built thousands or potentially tens of thousands of years before the first boat we can physically identify. But crossing water created another challenge. Navigation. A river is forgiving. It generally tells you where it is going. The open ocean is less cooperative. There are no road signs, no landmarks in the middle of the sea, no convenient arrow saying, civilization this way. And yet humans eventually crossed enormous stretches of ocean. This is where the story stops being merely about floating wood. It becomes a story about accumulated knowledge, the movement of stars, the direction of waves, seasonal winds, currents, cloud formations, bird behavior, the shape of islands, the timing of storms. A successful voyage could depend on knowledge that was never written down. And that means a sophisticated boat was only half the technology. The other half lived inside human memory. Consider the Pacific. Beginning around 3,000 years ago, Lapita peoples expanded across parts of the western Pacific using sophisticated sailing canoes. Later Polynesian navigators carried the same broad tradition of maritime exploration vastly farther into the Pacific. Research into ancient Pacific canoes shows that their performance and navigation technologies allowed people to make remarkable migrations across enormous ocean spaces. At this point, the original problem has almost completely transformed. The first problem may have been, how do I get across this stream? Now the problem is, how do I cross an ocean to an island I may not be able to see? That is not a small improvement. It is a completely different category of human ability. And notice what happened. The boat did not simply become better. The world became bigger. An island that was previously isolated could become reachable. A coastline could become a transportation network. A river could connect communities. A sea could connect economies. And eventually, boats began carrying something even more important than people. Surplus. Wood. Stone. Food. Animals. Raw materials. Ideas. And inevitably power. That transition is visible dramatically in ancient Egypt. By the first dynasty around 5,000 years ago, Egyptians were building substantial wooden boats. The boat burials at Abydos contain some of the oldest known stone plank hulls, and evidence suggests these vessels could be dismantled and transported overland between the Nile and the Red Sea. That detail is easy to overlook. A boat that can be carried over land sounds almost ridiculous, until you realize what it means. The Egyptians were no longer simply adapting to a river. They were connecting different bodies of water. The boat had become infrastructure. It was part vehicle, part engineering system, part economic tool. And once a society can move heavy objects by water, the economics of distance change dramatically. Moving something heavy over land requires enormous effort. Put the same load onto a floating vessel and water does much of the supporting work for you. The boat is essentially outsourcing weight to physics. and humans were very happy to accept the free labor. This is one reason waterways became so important to early civilizations. The invention of the boat did not merely make travel easier. It changed which places were economically valuable. It changed where people could settle. It expanded trade. It made certain resources accessible. It allowed rulers to project power along rivers and coastlines. And it connected communities that might otherwise have remained separated. But there is an even stranger consequence. Boats changed what far away meant. Before reliable watercraft, a body of water could define the edge of your world. After reliable watercraft, the same body of water could become the easiest route through it. The sea had been a barrier. Now it was a highway. And this transformation happened independently in many parts of the world because humans repeatedly faced the same physical problem. Water does not care which civilization is looking at it. A person in a wetland, an island community in the Pacific, a hunter beside a northern lake, and a river society in Africa all encounter the same basic constraint. Humans sink. Wood floats. The solutions, however, depend on the environment. Where suitable trees are abundant, a dugout canoe makes sense. Where reeds grow densely, bundled boats can work. Where long-distance ocean travel matters, stability, propulsion, sail design, and navigation become increasingly important. Different environments produced different engineering traditions. Same problem, different answers. And this is why there probably was never a single moment when the boat was invented. There were countless small inventions. Someone discovered a better way to shape wood. Someone else learned how to bind materials together. Someone discovered that a particular hull shape handled waves better. Someone figured out how to balance a vessel. Someone learned to use wind. Someone developed a better paddle. Someone memorized the behavior of currents. Most of these people disappeared without names. But their experiments accumulated. Technology rarely arrives as a lightning bolt. More often, it is sediment. One useful idea settles on top of another until, eventually, something that looks obvious appears. The canoe, the raft, the sailing vessel, the cargo ship, the ocean-going catamaran. Each seems like a finished invention when we look backward. But from inside history, it would have looked like a series of problems that had to be solved one at a time. And there was no guarantee that every solution would work. A boat could be too heavy, too unstable, too difficult to steer, too expensive to build, too fragile for the sea, or perfectly functional in one environment and useless in another. The history of boats is therefore also a history of trade-offs. More cargo can mean less speed. Greater stability can mean more drag. A larger sail can provide more power but demands a stronger structure. A stronger hull requires more material. More material requires more labor. And more labor requires organization. This is where a simple piece of floating wood begins to transform society. Because once boats become valuable enough, you need specialists. People who understand timber. People who know how to shape hulls. People who understand ropes and sails. People who navigate. People who maintain vessels. People who trade. People who control ports. The boat begins creating an entire ecosystem around itself. And that ecosystem can become more important than the original invention. Look back at the pest canoe. A person looking at it today might see a simple hollowed-out log. But that simplicity is deceptive. It represents an entire chain of knowledge that had to exist before anyone could make it. Where to find the right tree, how to bring it down, how to hollow it, how much wood to remove, how much to leave, how to make it float, how to balance inside it, how to propel it, how to keep from turning an ordinary fishing trip into an unexpectedly wet archaeological excavation. The canoe is the physical object. The real invention is the knowledge behind it. And that knowledge allowed humans to do something profoundly unusual. It allowed us to live beyond the limits of our bodies. We could not fly, so we built aircraft. We could not breathe underwater, so we built submarines. We could not naturally cross oceans, so we built vessels that turned water from an obstacle into a surface beneath our feet. And once we did that, the map of human possibility changed. Today, you can look at an ordinary boat and see fiberglass, steel, engines, navigation systems, electronics. It can feel like an entirely modern machine. But underneath all of that is the same ancient question. Can something carry a human across water? The answer began with materials that were already floating. Then came control. Then distance. Then navigation. Then trade. Then power. And eventually, an entire civilization could be connected by something as simple as a floating structure. So perhaps the most important thing about the first boat is not that somebody invented a machine. It is that somebody discovered a new relationship with the planet. A river was no longer something you had to stop at. A lake was no longer simply something you had to walk around. An ocean was no longer the absolute end of the map. Water became a surface. And once humans learned to move across it, the world became much harder to keep apart. That is why the first boat was more than a vessel. It was a new way of understanding distance. And somewhere, thousands of years before the oldest surviving canoe, a person stepped onto something that floated, pushed away from shore, and discovered that the world did not end at the water. Continued.